The shipyard had no name on any public record. It floated in the shadow of Jupiter, hidden behind the planet's vast curve, tucked so deep into the darkness that no passing ship would ever notice it. There were no lights on its outer hull, no identification codes broadcast into the void. It was, by every measure, invisible. Inside, it was anything but quiet. Admiral Soren Max stood on the command deck of the shipyard station and looked out through the reinforced viewport at the thing being built in front of her. It was long, very long. Its hull was dark gray, almost black, made from a metal alloy that humans had spent 40 years developing in secret. It had no decorations, no painted markings, no nameplate yet. It was just steel and fire and purpose. She had been staring at ships like this one for 22 years. Her coffee had gone cold again. She did not notice. "Hull plating on Section 7 is complete," said Lieutenant Danvers, reading from his screen without looking up. "Engine core installation begins tomorrow. Estimated commission date is 41 days. Max gave a small nod. That was ship number 703. She remembered the first one. She had been a young commander back then, barely 40 years old, assigned to a program she was told did not exist. The briefing had lasted 6 hours. At the end of it, she had sat alone in a small room for a long time and looked at her hands. That had been 61 years ago. The program was called Pale Forge. It did not appear in any government budget that the public could see. It was not discussed in any open session of any parliament on Earth. It was funded through a chain of shell organizations, asteroid mining contracts, and deep space resource operations that looked completely ordinary on paper. Every person who worked on it had signed documents that carried more legal weight than most treaties. There were approximately 9,000 people who knew about Pale Forge. In 61 years, not one of them had talked. That was, Max had always thought, the most impressive thing humanity had ever done. The ships themselves were called Gravedigger-class warships. The name had been chosen by the original program architects, back before Max had joined. She had not liked the name at first. It sounded dramatic, even arrogant. But over the years she had come to understand it. A gravedigger did not start fights. It ended them. It was not a weapon of anger. It was a weapon of finality. Each ship was 11 kilometers long. Each one carried enough firepower to crack the crust of a planet from high orbit in under 18 minutes. They had rail cannons that could accelerate a projectile to a fraction of the speed of light. They had missile systems that could track a target across a solar system. They had point defense grids that could stop almost anything thrown at them. They were not the biggest ships humanity had ever imagined. They were the most practical. Max walked slowly along the viewport, her hands behind her back. Outside, workers in pressure suits moved across the hull of the new ship like tiny insects on a whale. Sparks floated in the darkness and died. Robotic arms swung massive sections of plating into place with a precision that was almost graceful. She thought about the first ship again. Ship number 1 had taken 11 years to build. Ship 703 would be done in 41 days. That was what 6 decades of practice looked like. Her tablet buzzed. She glanced at it. The message was from Earth, from the security annex, which was the only body on the planet that knew the full scope of what was being built out here. The message was short. It said, "Signal update. Check attached file." Max did not open the file yet. She already knew what it would say. The signal from beyond the outer rim had been sending the same mathematical pattern for 6 decades, slow and steady and absolutely regular, like a heartbeat. Each update from the analysis team was another attempt to refine the numbers. Each update made the picture a little clearer and a little worse. She had named the thing in the signal herself, quietly, in her own notes. She called it the recursion. She did not know if it was a fleet, a single object, or something else entirely. She only knew what it had done to the civilizations it had already passed through. 3 of them, all dead, all gone so completely that if you did not know where to look, you would never find what was left. She had found what was left. Her teams had spent 15 years piecing it together from broken signals, dead satellites, and empty space where habitable worlds used to be. The rest of the galaxy did not know. Not because humanity was cruel, not because humanity wanted an advantage, but because 61 years ago, a small group of very serious people had sat in a room and asked a simple question. If we tell everyone right now, what happens? The answer had been obvious. Panic, political collapse, wars started out of fear before the real threat even arrived, civilizations spending their energy fighting each other instead of preparing. The galaxy was not a unified body. It was a loose collection of species held together by a council that had no real military power and a long history of not trusting each other. If you told 47 species that something was coming to destroy them all, you would get 47 different responses. Most of them would be wrong. So humanity had said nothing, and humanity had built. Max finally opened the file from Earth. She read it once. Then she read it again. The signal had changed rhythm. Just slightly. Just enough to matter. The recursion was not coming in 50 years, as the old estimates had said. The new estimate was closer to 40. Maybe less. She closed the file. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway. How many ships are currently operational? She asked, still looking out the viewport. 847 confirmed combat ready, said Danvers. 200 support vessels. The 3-star Anvil platforms are at 91% completion. Max nodded slowly. 847. 2 years ago it had been 600. The pace was increasing. The program had been built on a simple idea. You could not stop something like the recursion with a small fleet, no matter how good the technology. You needed mass. You needed numbers. You needed ships that could fight and lose and still have more ships behind them. She thought about the other civilizations out there, the Keth, with their careful science and their beautiful star maps. The Sathrek, proud and territorial and deeply afraid of anything they could not control. The Horathi, who had the biggest military in the known galaxy and had not built a new class of warship in over 100 years because they believed nobody would ever dare challenge them. None of them knew what was coming. Max put down her coffee cup. She turned away from the viewport and walked back toward the command desk. "Get me a line to Earth," she said. "It is time to write the presentation." Danvers looked up. He had been with her for 18 years. He understood what that meant. "How long do we have?" Max did not answer right away. She sat down at the desk and pulled the star map up on the main screen. The outer rim glowed faintly. Beyond it, in the cold dark between the galaxies, something very large was moving in their direction. "Not long enough," she said, "but more than 0. Start the clock." The Keth survey drone was a small, quiet machine. It had been traveling the outer edges of the solar system for 3 standard months, doing the work that Keth drones had done for centuries, mapping, measuring, recording. The Keth were the best cartographers in the known galaxy. They had charted more star systems than any other species. They were meticulous, patient, and deeply proud of their work. The drone's name was Survey Unit Aleph 14. It had no feelings about this. It was passing around the far side of Jupiter at a distance of approximately 2 million kilometers when its sensors detected something unusual. Not a ship, not a station, a bloom, an electromagnetic bloom of significant size and density, radiating from a region of space that all existing charts marked as empty. The drone, following its programming, did exactly what it was built to do. It recorded everything. It turned toward the source. It sent a tight beam signal back to the nearest Keth relay station. Then it looked closer. What it found was not one thing. It was 94 things, lined up in loose formation, their engine signatures running in a synchronized pattern that the drone had never been programmed to recognize, because no one had ever seen anything like it before. The ships were dark. They were enormous, and they were clearly not the ships of any civilization the Keth had on record. The drone recorded for 11 minutes, then it returned to its route, because it was a drone and it had no concept of urgency. The signal reached the Keth relay station 6 hours later. From there, it moved to the main Keth analysis center on the station Veluin, which served as the headquarters of the Galactic Council of Accord. It arrived on the desk of senior cartographer Evie Toreth at the start of her morning shift. She opened it, expecting routine data. She read it 3 times, getting progressively more still with each pass. Then she called her supervisor. Her supervisor called his superior. That superior called the Keth Council representative directly. By the end of that day, 12 species knew something was wrong. The information spread the way bad news always spreads, faster than anyone intended and in more directions than anyone planned. By the second day, it had reached the Sethrek, who were one of the most powerful reptilian species in the inner cluster, and who had a long history of reacting to surprises with military mobilization. By the third day, it had reached the Harathi Empire, who were the dominant military power in the known galaxy, and who reacted to the news with a kind of cold, controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than outright panic. By the end of the first week, 31 of the 47 species in the Council knew that something very large had been hidden near Jupiter's shadow, and every single one of them had the same first thought: humans. The Council session that followed was not technically an emergency session. Nobody wanted to call it that, because calling it that meant admitting they were afraid. So, it was listed on the official schedule as an extraordinary consultative assembly, which meant the same thing, but sounded more controlled. Ambassador Toval Sis of the Sethrek arrived early. He was tall, covered in dark green scales, and he moved the way most Sethrek moved, with a precision that suggested he was always ready to strike. He had been the Sethrek representative to the Council for 30 years. He had negotiated treaties, settled border disputes, and attended more formal dinners than he cared to count. He was not by nature a man who panicked. He was also not stupid. He found Delegate Asha Noor of Humanity standing near the window of the pre-session hall, looking out at the station's observation ring with a cup of something warm in her hands. She was a small woman, dark-skinned, with gray hair cut very short, and calm brown eyes that gave nothing away. She was perhaps 60 years old, though Toval Sis had never been able to tell exactly. He crossed the room and stopped beside her. "We know about the ships," he said. He did not bother with a greeting. There was no point. Asha turned to look at him. She did not look surprised. She did not look frightened. She looked, if anything, like someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "I know you do," she said. "How many?" he asked. She looked back out the window. Outside, the stars were very still. "Quite a few," she said. Toval Sis felt something cold move through him. In 30 years of diplomacy, he had learned to read silences. This one was not the silence of someone who had been caught doing something wrong. This was the silence of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and was not yet ready to put it down. "You will address the full council," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," said Asha. "We would like to give a formal presentation. We ask that you invite everyone, all 47. What will you tell them?" She turned to look at him again. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. Not guilt, not fear. Something closer to the look a person gets when they are about to say something they have been rehearsing for years, and are still not sure will land the way they intend. "The truth," she said. "All of it." By the time the formal session was called, the mood in the council chamber was unlike anything most of the delegates had ever experienced. The Harathi representative, a broad-shouldered being called Veth Karan, sat with his arms folded and his jaw tight. The Keth ambassador, a soft-spoken creature named Soli Sven, was reviewing sensor data for the 5th time. Several smaller species had clustered together in one corner of the gallery, speaking in low voices. There were species in that room who had been formally at peace with humanity for over 100 years. There were species who traded with humans, who had human researchers on their stations, who had sent their children to study at human universities. and every single one of them was now looking at the human delegation with something new in their eyes. Not hatred, not exactly. Fear. Asha Noor sat at the human table with 2 aides. She had no visible security. She had brought no weapons, no military attaché, no display of force. She had brought a holographic projector and a small hard drive. She waited while the session chair called the assembly to order. She waited while Toval Sis formally raised the discovery of the ships as the primary agenda item. She waited while 3 other ambassadors made short, nervous statements about what they had seen in the data. Then she stood up. The room went quiet very fast. "We have been building," she said simply. "For 61 years. We have been building, and we have been quiet, and we know that this requires an explanation. Admiral Soren Max, who has led this program for 22 years, will be here within 48 hours to give that explanation in full." Veth Karan of the Harathi leaned forward. "And until then," he said. His voice was controlled, but only just. Asha looked at him with those calm, steady eyes. "Until then," she said, "I would ask you not to scramble your fleets. Because what the Admiral has to show you will change everything. And we will need every ship that exists, including yours." The chamber erupted, voices, clicks, hisses, and the deep thrumming sound that meant the Harathi were very, very angry. Asha sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She waited. She had been waiting for 61 years. 48 more hours was nothing. Admiral Soren Max had never been to the council chamber before. She had seen pictures of it, of course. Everyone had. It was one of the most photographed places in the known galaxy. A wide, circular hall, with tiered seating for 47 species, a domed ceiling made of transparent material that looked out at open space, and a central floor of polished dark stone that had been walked on by diplomats and leaders for 200 years. She thought it looked smaller in person. She walked in wearing her full uniform, dark gray, no medals, no decorations except for a single small pin above her left breast that marked her rank. Her 2 aides walked behind her. She carried the holographic projector herself. The room was completely full. Every delegation had sent either their primary ambassador, or in several cases, a head of state. Everyone was watching her. She had prepared for this moment for 22 years. She had rehearsed the words in her head 10,000 times. She had run scenarios, considered angles, thought about what questions they would ask, and how she would answer them. She was ready. She walked to the center of the floor, set the projector down, and sat at the plain table that had been placed there for her. She opened a star map. The projection filled the air above the table. The galaxy, familiar and beautiful, stars laid out in their slow arms. The delegates leaned forward slightly. Some of them had their translation devices turned up. 61 years ago, Max said, her voice level, our deep space analysis team detected a signal. It came from beyond the outer rim, from a region of space that no known species has ever charted. The signal was a mathematical sequence. It repeated every 4 hours and 17 minutes, without variation, for 3 years before we finished decoding it. She moved her hand. A section of the star map highlighted in pale red, the region beyond the outer edge. What the sequence described was a movement pattern. Specifically, the movement pattern of a very large formation of objects traveling through deep space in a specific direction. This direction. A line appeared on the map. It traced a path from the far dark edge all the way through the outer rim, through the mid-clusters, and directly through the heart of the Council's territory. Several delegates made sounds. We named it the recursion. We do not know if it is a fleet in the way we understand fleets, or a single structure, or something else. What we do know is what it has left behind. The map shifted. 3 star systems lit up in the outer rim, far from any of the species represented in this room. They were small labels, the names that the civilizations there had called their home systems, before. These 3 systems were inhabited. The first was a species we have no name for, because they had no contact with the rest of the galaxy. We found them through their old radio signals. 50,000 years of broadcasts, ending abruptly 200 years ago. The second system contained a civilization that had made contact with the Harathi Empire approximately 400 years ago, before the records of that contact were filed away and forgotten. Max looked directly at the Harathi delegation. Veth Karen's face was unreadable. "You have those records," she said. "We found them in your own archives. We are not accusing you of anything. Nobody knew what had happened to that civilization. You did not know what had destroyed them. We did not know either, until we put all of it together." She turned back to the map. "The third system we found through physical evidence alone. Our ships entered it 12 years ago. We did not find ruins. We found fragments. Orbital debris that was once a planet. Residual heat signatures in the gas cloud that suggested something had passed through that system and simply consumed everything in it." The room was quiet in a way that rooms rarely are. Not the quiet of people being polite. The quiet of people who had stopped breathing. "The recursion is not interested in conquest," Max continued. "It does not occupy systems. It does not demand surrender. It passes through, and after it passes through, there is nothing left. Not the planets, not the stations, not the ships. Nothing." She let that settle for a moment. "Our best estimate as of this week is that the recursion will reach the outer edge of Council space in approximately 40 years, possibly fewer. The signal has changed rhythm in the last month, which suggests it is accelerating." Toval Sis spoke. His voice was very controlled. "And you built a fleet?" "Yes," said Max, without telling anyone. "Yes." "For 61 years?" "Yes." Toval Sis looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he said, and this time the word carried more than anger. It carried something genuinely confused, genuinely hurt. "Why would you do this alone? Why would you not share this with us?" Max had prepared for this question more than any other. "We modeled what would happen if we announced a threat of this scale to 47 species who did not fully trust each other, who had no unified military structure, and who had a documented history of starting wars with each other during periods of fear. The models were very clear. If we announced the recursion 60 years ago, the probability of a large-scale interspecies conflict before the recursion even arrived was over 70%. Several civilizations in this room would not exist today. We did not tell you because we were afraid of you. We told you now because we have enough." She opened the second file. The fleet manifest appeared in the air. 847 ship silhouettes, arranged in clean rows. Each one labeled. Each one listed as combat ready. Below that, 200 support ships. Below that, 3 larger shapes, labeled Star Anvil platforms. "These 3 platforms are capable of inducing gravitational collapse in a mid-sized star," Max said. "We built them as area denial weapons. We do not intend to use them unless we have no other option." The room did not erupt this time. It stayed very, very quiet. It was the Keth ambassador, Solus Fen, who broke the silence. He was a small, soft creature with large eyes, and he had been sitting very still through the entire presentation. Now he made a sound that his translation device rendered as a sob. Not from fear, from something his species did not have a precise word for. Humans called it relief, the particular kind of relief that comes when you realize the terrible thing you are carrying alone was in fact being carried by someone else all along. Max looked at him. She said nothing. She had said enough. Outside the chamber's transparent dome, the stars continued their slow, indifferent burning. Somewhere beyond them, out in the cold space between galaxies, something vast and ancient and hungry was still moving. But for the first time in 61 years, more than one species knew it was coming. And for the first time in 61 years, Soren Max let herself breathe. The tribunal was held 6 weeks after the council presentation. It had been demanded by the Harathi Empire, seconded by 3 smaller species who were afraid of looking weak if they did not also object. And it had been granted by the council chair, who was a careful politician and understood that some fires needed to be given a controlled space to burn before they spread. The charge, formally, was violation of the Council Non-Armament Compact of 2211, an agreement that all member species would disclose the construction of weapons systems capable of planetary-scale destruction. Admiral Max arrived at the tribunal alone. She sat across from a panel of 7, representing the Harathi, the Sethrek, the Keth, and 4 smaller species. Veth Karan of the Harathi sat at the center of the panel. He had the look of a man who had decided on the verdict before the proceedings began. The prosecution laid out its case over 3 hours. The Paleforge program had been secret. The ships had been built without disclosure. The weaponry exceeded the limits defined in the compact. These were facts, and they were not disputed. When it was Max's turn to speak, she placed a single data drive on the table in front of her. "Every decision made in the Paleforge program is on this drive," she said. "Every budget approval, every command order, every risk assessment, every internal debate. All of it is dated, signed, and cross-referenced with the signal data that prompted each decision. Nothing was hidden from our own government. Nothing was done for personal gain. No ship in our fleet has ever been pointed at a council member's territory. I invite this panel to review every file." Veth Karan leaned forward. "That is not the point," he said. "The point is that you made a decision on behalf of the entire galaxy without asking the galaxy. You decided what we could handle. You decided what we needed to know. Who gave humanity that right?" Max looked at him steadily. "Nobody," she said. "We gave it to ourselves, because nobody else was going to." "I understand your anger," Max continued. "If I were sitting where you are, I would be angry too. You are right that we made a choice that was not ours alone to make. I am not going to pretend otherwise. What I will say is this: if we had made the other choice, if we had stood up 61 years ago and announced to the galaxy that something was coming to destroy everything, I do not believe this panel would exist today. I do not believe this council would exist. I believe most of the species represented here would have spent the last 60 years at each other's throats, because that is what fear does to people who don't trust each other. And when the recursion arrived, there would have been nothing left to fight it with." She paused. "I did not make this choice because I thought humanity was better than you. I made it because I was terrified, and because I had 847 ships and nobody else did, and because someone had to." Veth Karan stared at her for a long time. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, just slightly. The tribunal did not acquit humanity. It also did not convict. After 4 days of deliberation, the panel issued a finding of exceptional circumstances, a legal category that had never been used before, and which essentially meant, you broke the rules were probably wrong, and we are not going to punish you, because we need you. It was, Max thought, about as good as she had hoped for. The alliance building that followed was not clean. It was never going to be clean. 31 of the 47 species voted to formally integrate their fleets under a joint command structure with human tactical leadership. This meant humans would coordinate strategy, humans would set defensive positions, and human admirals would have the authority to direct non-human ships in combat. The Harathi refused. Veth Karan's statement was brief and precise. The Harathi Empire did not place its military under foreign command. It had not done so in 700 years. It would not do so now. The Harathi would defend their own territory in their own way. Nobody tried very hard to change his mind. They had 40 years to work with, possibly fewer. There was no time to spend on pride. The Harathi, quietly, within 2 weeks of the tribunal, requested technical schematics for the Gravedigger-class hull plating. Humanity sent them without comment. Delegate Asha Nur addressed the council one final time before the formal alliance documents were signed. She stood at the same spot on the central floor where Max had stood 6 weeks earlier. She did not use a projector. She just spoke. There are people in your delegations who are still angry with us. I understand that. There are people who feel that we stole something from you, the right to know, the right to choose, the right to prepare in your own way. I do not think they are entirely wrong. She looked around the room. What I know is this. For 61 years, a small number of human beings carried the weight of knowing what was coming. They got up every day and went to work and built ships and did mathematics and looked at data that said everything you love is going to be erased. And they kept doing it, and they kept quiet, because they believed that the best way to protect you was to not let you see how afraid they were. That was not arrogance. That was love. It was clumsy, and it was unauthorized, and it was done without your knowledge or your consent, and I am sorry for that. But it was love. The hall was still. We did not carry that fear because we thought you were weak, she said. We carried it because we knew you were worth protecting. And now we are going to ask you to stand with us and face this together, and I promise you, that what we have built is enough to hold the line, if we hold it together. The vote for the alliance was 34-13. 3 more species had changed their minds during the speech. Even some of the 13 who voted against signed bilateral defense agreements within the month. The recursion was still coming. The dark at the edge of the galaxy was still moving in their direction. But for the first time in 61 years, they were not facing it alone. The recursion came 38 years early. There was no warning beyond the signal change, and by the time the analysis teams had finished arguing about what the new rhythm meant, the outer rim sensors had already started going dark. Not failing, dark. Something was moving through them and leaving nothing behind. Admiral Max received the alert at 0347 station time. She was already awake. She had not been sleeping well for the past month. Something in her bones had been telling her that the clock was almost done. She dressed in 4 minutes. She was on the command deck in 7. The display screens showed the outer rim in real time, or as close to real time as the relay network allowed. A chain of sensor buoys stretched along the defensive perimeter like a line of lights. They were going out, one by one, from the far edge inward, at a steady and terrible pace. Lieutenant Danvers was already at his post. He did not look up when she walked in. Estimated contact with forward fleet positions in 9 hours, he said. Max sat down. She pulled up the fleet positions on her secondary screen. 847 Gravedigger-class warships were already deployed along the threshold line. The defensive perimeter that human strategic planners had spent years calculating as the best place to make a stand. Far enough from inhabited systems to limit civilian exposure. Close enough to the outer rim to give them fighting room. Behind the gravediggers, the Allied fleet had taken position. 31 species, hundreds of ships, all shapes and sizes and designs, all running on slightly different systems, all trying to communicate through translation protocols that had been written in a hurry over the past decade. It was not a perfectly organized force. It was the best they had. The 3 Star Anvil platforms were already charging. Max opened a channel to the fleet command network. Her voice went out to every human ship on the line, and from there was relayed to every Allied vessel. This is Admiral Max. The recursion has reached the outer rim. Sensor contact in approximately 9 hours. All ships hold position. All captains confirm readiness. The confirmations came back in a wave. 847 human ships, followed by the Allied responses in their own formats and languages, translated into a simple green signal on her board. Every ship ready. Every crew at station. She stared at the board for a moment. Then she said, "Good. Hold the line." The first contact happened at hour 8, not 9. The recursion was moving faster than the updated models had suggested. The forward picket ships, 6 gravediggers stationed 3 light hours ahead of the main line as early warning, encountered the first wave of recursion units at the edge of sensor range. What came through on the data feeds was difficult to process. The recursion units were not ships in any recognizable sense. They were objects, dark, massive, irregular in shape, each one roughly the size of a small moon. They moved without visible propulsion. They emitted no radio signals, no targeting broadcasts, no communications of any kind. They simply moved forward, and where they moved, space became very quiet. The 6 picket ships fired everything they had. Their rail cannons sent dense projectiles at a fraction of light speed into the leading recursion units. 3 of the units visibly slowed. 2 showed structural damage. 1 stopped moving entirely. 2 of the picket ships were destroyed before they could complete their firing runs. The other 4 pulled back to the main line. Max watched the data. 2 destroyed, 4 survived, 1 recursion unit stopped. The math was not comfortable, but it was not impossible. She activated the star anvil sequence. The 3 platforms were positioned at carefully calculated points along the recursion's projected path. Each one was aimed not at the recursion units themselves, but at a point slightly ahead of them, a red dwarf star that sat in the recursion's path like a stone in a road. It was an uninhabited system. Nobody lived there. Nobody had ever lived there. The star anvil platforms fired in sequence, 17 seconds apart. What happened to the red dwarf is difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen a star collapse in a controlled burn. It did not explode. It folded, pulled inward by a gravitational charge that the star anvil platforms had seeded into its core over the previous 6 months of pre-positioning. It collapsed into a dense dark remnant and then released the energy of that collapse in a directed wave that moved outward in the direction of the recursion's advance. The shockwave and debris field hit the recursion's main formation at 0.12 the speed of light. For 19 hours, the recursion's advance slowed. Their formation broke. The dense wave of stellar matter was not enough to destroy them, but it disrupted their movement, scattered their units, and created a region of space that their forward elements could not move through cleanly. 19 hours was exactly what Max needed. The Gravedigger fleet moved. 847 ships hit the exposed flank of the scattered recursion formation in a coordinated strike that had been planned and rehearsed for 12 years. They fired in rotating volleys, never all at once, always cycling, keeping a constant pressure while individual ships fell back to recharge and repair. The Allied fleet moved to support the flanks, covering the angles that the Gravediggers could not watch while they pressed forward. 3 human ships were lost in the first hour, then 5 more. The recursion units fought back in ways that were strange and terrible, not with weapons that could be clearly identified, but with forces that simply crushed anything too close, like a pressure that had no obvious source. When a Gravedigger got too near a recursion unit, the hull reading spiked and then went silent. Max watched her board. She counted the losses. She did not look away. At hour 11, the recursion's advance stopped. At hour 14, they began to pull back. Not in retreat, or not what any of the species present would have called retreat. It was more like a recalculation. The vast dark objects slowed, paused, and then began moving back the way they had come, slowly, like something that had encountered an obstacle it had not expected, and was choosing to go around. The firing continued for 2 more hours, as the fleet pursued to the edge of the defensive perimeter. Then Max called a halt. Pursuing past the line was not part of the plan. The plan was to hold the line, and they had held it. When the last recursion signature faded from the display boards, the command deck was very quiet. Then, someone started clapping. A single pair of hands, somewhere behind Max. Then another. Then the whole bridge. Not just the human crew, but the Keth liaison officer who had been embedded with the fleet for the past 3 years. And the 2 Sethrek tactical observers, who had not left their stations in 31 hours. And the young Harathi signals officer who had transferred in 6 months ago, and who had, in the end, stood with the fleet after all. Max did not turn around. She looked at the empty space on the display where the recursion had been. She thought about 61 years of early mornings and cold coffee and the particular loneliness of knowing something nobody else knows. She thought about the 9,000 people who had kept the secret. She thought about the ones who had died before they got to see this day. She closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Then she opened them. The recursion was not gone. It would be back, In 10 years, or 20, or 50. It had retreated, not been destroyed. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. Back to work, she said. And the fleet that had held the edge of everything turned its ships around and began the long, quiet journey home.